Radosevic, I'm Consul General of the Republic of Serbia here in Sydney. Welcome to these premises of the Consul General of Serbia. It's my great honor and privilege to welcome you all tonight and to thank you for coming. Honorable Chris Case, Federal Member for Fowler, and Mrs. Hayes, Honorable Paul Lynch, the Southwest Member of Parliament for Liverpool, Mrs. Wendy former Mayor of Liverpool, Ms. Biljana, Tomka. Welcome all. It's a privilege really to be host of such occasion where we're presenting the book, you know. Nowadays, you know, book seems that it's going, you know. Gutenberg Galaxy, obviously, you know, has no such popularity like it was before, and Slobo is becoming, you know, he's doing it very, you know, hard. And last year we had promotion in Liverpool of one of his books. Now it's a new one, so you know, I'm really glad and privileged to be host of presentation of this book tonight. I especially would like to welcome the guests who arrived from all over Australia. I heard from Perth, from Brisbane, from like everywhere, you know, and it shows the interest for this book, and I'm glad that you know, we are here tonight to celebrate this effort of Mr. Lazovic, because, you know, everybody's forgetting. I remember when I was first time in Perth, you know, I was in King's Park. I saw on the memorial, you know, number of names of Slavic origin which, you know, died during the World War I. And when you are reading these books and when you see all these people coming and how they built this beautiful country and how they contribute even with their lives, you know, for the betterment of this country, then you realize that it's good that this be somehow, you know, saved for our kids, saved for the generation who will come after us. And I'm very grateful to Slobo for this. These 3 books Slobo gave as a present to National Library of Serbia, and I thank him for that. So without much delay, you know, I would like to just to wish you that you feel like at home. It's our all custom to say feel at home, and I'm sure that after this formal part we will have more time to be together. And thank you once again for coming tonight.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mirina Muir from the Montenegro Cultural Art Society, Njegos, Sidneju. Before I start, I would just like to make a special mention to the publishers of this book, Medeon Podgorica, Mr. Bojan Popovic, and also Globi Prem Podgorica, Mr. Boris Golshovic. I'd like to now call upon Duska JOKANOVIC, who will be reading a poem called Ancestral Crna Gora by Danilo Jovanovic.
Ancestral Crna Gora. Crna Gora, Crna Gora, land from whence my father came. How my heart with rapture pulses when I hear thy fabled name. And I hear soft voices calling from the mountains wild and free, accompanied by the gusla with its haunting melody. So I look towards the shoreline where the northern lights appear. There historic visions haunt me and the pictures are so clear. Ubavojnom Crna Gora, land of valor, calm and strong. In my heart I hear thee singing, and it is a patriot's song. Know ye not that I have languished in a land across the foam? Only God can give an answer. You have always been my home. There is no land that is perfect, but within this heart of mine, Stara Crna Gora leadeth in the golden book divine. When the continent of Europe by the invaders were caught, Crna Gora stood surrounded. For 500 years she fought. There it was on blood-stained mountains, amid the slush and slime and snow. Nurses tended wounded soldiers there 500 years ago. Unaided there she stood alone, the foe could not transgress. With ammunition running low, she melted her printing press. Marko Drekalovic, I hear you as your blood stirs in my veins, and I mourn for fallen heroes on the far Kosovan plains. Bishop Njegos wrote your history in his brilliant mountain reef, so I prefer mine own effort and my heart to you bequeath. O smallest amongst all kingdoms, with the purest of ideas, yet transcending all the nations with the greatest mountaineers. Crown of the Balkans unblemished, forever to you I'm bound. May God in mercy allow me to tread the hallowed ground. Only unity of purpose with humility and grace, coupled with a contrite heart, can mould the Slavonic race. Crna Gora, my affection, is a love, a passion, a fire, which consumes me with a yearning till the time that I expire.
Thank you, Duska. I now call upon Mirina Muir about the presentation of the book, Our Legends Under the Southern Cross.
Thank you. Consul General Radosevic, distinguished guests, friends, family, fellow Montenegrins, hello and welcome. My task tonight is to launch the English version of Our Legends Under the Southern Cross. What a fitting place to be, here in Sydney, where many of the families whose stories are told in this book commence their journey. For me, tonight is very special, for I am one of the granddaughters of George JOKANOVIC, who is one of the proud Montenegrins profiled. He's also the good-looking bloke on the front cover. I am also the niece of Danilo JOKANOVIC, the author of the poems in the book. At this point, I want to give thanks to the author, Slobodan Lazovic, for having the courage and commitment to write this book and have it published in English. As a second-generation Montenegrin Australian, the publishing of this book provides me and all other descendants with a little insight into the journey of our ancestors as they forged a new life in Australia. The book tells of stories of a number of Montenegrins who left Crna Gora in search of a new homeland. It tells of the men and women who migrated to Australia. The stories traverse the challenges that each of them faced. In writing each of the stories, Slobodan has gone beyond the original migrants to the second, third and fourth generations. You know, that was a little bit crafty on Slobodan's part, as it completely grabs the attention of successive generations. And for this I must give thanks. What a wonderful way to help us identify with our heritage, allow us to feel proud, and in a small way understand who we are. Australia is a multicultural society. Having a book that records and tells the stories of Montenegrins as they carve out their life in Australia during the early 1900s is so important. The bravery of these men and women as they make Australia their new homeland defines us as a nation and makes us strong. There are many great stories in the book of everyday life as a migrant, the successes and failures that each of them faced. Of women who bravely travelled to Australia as a bride to marry a man she had only seen in a photograph and heard stories about. Of course, I am referring to the Andrich family. Together, Laszlo and Senka, happily married and have 10 children and 31 grandchildren. It also tells of men who joined the Australian Armed Forces during World War I and returned to Europe to fight against the oppression of the Ottoman Empire. Many Montenegrins volunteered and stood alongside other Australian servicemen, united as one under the Australian flag. There are also stories of just ordinary people, like the Radanovics and Milo Nikotic. These families arrived in Fremantle. Laszlo Radanovic settles in Kalgoorlie Boulder in Western Australia and Milo in Broken Hill in New South Wales. For the Radanovics, they were seeking to escape oppression and poverty. Western Australia is rich in natural resources, and they worked hard in the mines. The conditions back then were primitive compared to today. They survived race riots where their homes were burnt to a shell. With nowhere else to live, they make do, continuing to live in their house while they rebuild for many months on end, eating tins of bully beef and baked beans, as there was nothing else available to them. Despite the hardship, life goes on, and with courage and conviction, life returns to normal. As peace was declared to end World War II, Milo, like many other migrants in Australia, returns to his homeland to help rebuild after the devastation of the war. He meets his wife, Jella. They marry and return to Australia. On arriving in Perth after 47 days at sea, Jella has her passport but no immigration papers. Despite this, the authorities take her passport, mark her as British born. Australia is now her new home. Like the Radanovics, like Milo, they put in place a framework to maintain and promote Montenegrin culture and arts within their communities in New South Wales and in Western Australia. Milo was recognised for his efforts with the Premier of New South Wales, Barry Unsworth, presenting him with the State Certificate of Merit as a pioneering immigrant. When I started this speech, I mentioned that I was the granddaughter of George Jovanovic, the good-looking bloke on the front cover. He, with his brother Spasio, are a pivotal story in the book. And yes, George, with his best mate Andrew Draskovic, and brother Spasio, were courageous. They were men who cared about humanity and peace, and in George's case, insisted his daughters are educated. Like many other families in this book, they were men of honour. However, there was another type of courage, like that of Ella Burt, who later became Ella Jovanovic. When George asked for Ella's hand in marriage, her family's ignorance saw them oppose the marriage. As the story goes, her family says, "You can't marry a man with the name Jovanovic. He's a foreigner. He'll have black children." Well, you know, George and Ella did get married, and guess what? Their children are not black. Ella carried the name Jovanovic with pride all her life, despite the discrimination she encountered from time to time. Over the years, Ella's parents grew to love and respect George. Ella and George were happily married until George died with cancer in 1961, just before I was born. On my birth, my parents, Mari and Ken Muir, who are here tonight, agreed that I should be named in memory of George. And so I carry the name of his sister, Mirina. Well, we anglicised it, but you know, I carry a little bit of my Montenegrin heritage with me every day. And I pass on that heritage as I meet people and they say to me, "Mirina, that's an unusual name. Where does it come from?" There are many speeches tonight, and so I've only talked about a few of the stories who cover the families in this book. And so now it is with great pleasure that on behalf of all the descendants of the men and women from Senogora who migrated to Australia to make it their new homeland, and might I say a better place, I launch this book.
I now call upon Milica DjURISIC to have a reading of the extract from the book Our Legends.
The two Andrich brothers, Vido and Lazo, came here in the distant 1927. Lazo was working cutting cane in northern Queensland near Cairns. Vido spent the larger part of his life laying railway sleepers in Western Australia. Vido was already married, Lazo wasn't. About 10 years after his arrival, Lazo too decided to marry and look for a girl in his native land. So he sent a message to his brother, Petar, who remained with his parents in Paštrovići, to take care of this, to look around and recommend his future bride. Petar did as his brother asked and decided to go to the village of Grude above Buljarice to Ivo Šoljaga. He told Ivo the purpose of his visit. Ivo had 4 daughters. The one he came to ask for was Senka. Once when I visited her, we started talking about her arrival in Australia and how she come to marry Lazo Andrich. So here is Senka's story. I arrived in 1938. I was 18 when I became engaged to Lazo. I did not choose my fiancé, nor had I ever heard about him until the day his brother Petar came to ask for my hand. One day, this Petar Andrich burst into our house. He was my mother's distant relative. I was on the terrace washing clothes. My father asked me to come into the house. I went in. On one side were my father and mother. On the other side was Petar. Senka, says my father, Petar came to ask you, will you marry his brother Lazo, who is in Australia? I had never even heard of Lazo Andrich before. I stopped in my tracks for a while. I could not speak. Father repeated the question. Well, Father, as you say, I whispered barely audibly. What could I have said? To say no, I don't want to, would not endear me to my parents and all my people. I agreed. To marry somewhere in America or Australia or anywhere in the world was considered a security in my life in comparison to the life in our lands as it was then. I went to Petrovac to have my photo taken, and this picture I sent to my future husband so that he could see me. The reply to my given word and the picture I sent took a fairly long time. I waited more than 3 months to receive it from Australia. This is why there were some doubts whether the whole thing would come to any fruition. Some people openly talked about it and made fun. It's easy to get the daughter engaged and married when there is no hide or hair of the bridegroom. As the engagement was announced and the reply from Australia took some time, the relatives and friends constantly asked me when I was going and was it really happening. Some people started to doubt it as the reply of my chosen one took time. The postmen were the main bearers of news. They were acquainted with things and they were the first who got to know the important news. They were in the first to notify whether a letter arrived or not. One day, however, the postman came and brought a letter. He gave it to my mother. He did not stop, as he used to have coffee and ask some questions. He immediately went down the street. But Mum called him to come into the house to have a coffee because now there is truly an engagement. Postman Niko, however, continued down the street, never turning back. When Petar, Lazo's brother, came again, he brought me Lazo's picture. That's when I saw him for the first time. After this, I went from my village Grude to live in Lazo's village Đurovići with his family. They received me nicely and looked after me. I stayed there at their place for almost a year, and from their house I left for Australia.
I can now call upon Professor Biljana Tomka from the City of Liverpool Library.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I met Mr. Lazovic 11 years ago at Liverpool Library while he was organizing the anniversary event of Montenegro's cultural society Njegos in Sydney. My association and friendship with Mr. Lazovic has continued from that first encounter 11 years ago, and I was present at the launch of his first book in 2008, Njegos petog kontinenta, Chronicles of Work and Activities of the Montenegrin Cultural Society, Njegos. I was impressed by the enthusiasm and passion which Mr. Lazovic actively participated in this society, and the humanitarian efforts which have led to the documentation of many stories into a single compilation. The book was received with great interest and positive reviews from both Mr. Lazovic friends and the wider community. Last year, Mr. Lazovic's new book, Our Legends Under the Southern Cross, was published in Serbian. However, tonight we gather to celebrate the translation of this book in English, which allows both the descendants of the early migrants whose tales it tells and the wider community to appreciate the valuable history it houses. Mr. Lazovic managed to collect, with the help of many others, a wealth of fascinating details and inspiring stories about life of our early migrants from Montenegro. I read this book with a great interest and found that destiny and varying parts of life that these pioneers encountered are very similar to those of the more recent immigrants in Australia. Yet they are uniquely inspiring and original, that each one has the potential to become a motion picture. The book starts by documenting the earliest known arrivals to Australia from Montenegro between 1860 and 1873. The stories follow the life journeys of Brother Jovanovic, George and Spasoje, who arrived in Australia in 1910, followed by Milo Nikezic, Krsto Mitrovic, Vido and Lazo Andrić, Savo Bečić and Luka Markovic, among many others. It also documents the building of the first Serbian Orthodox Church in Flemington in 1949. Their lengthy travels to Australia sometimes lasted years, and when they arrived in this unfamiliar land with unfamiliar language, they were met with laborious jobs that included working in mines and quarries and cutting sugarcane. But perhaps the most difficult of all challenges was the great distance of their old home to their new home and the separation from close friends and family. They dearly loved their homeland. Montenegro, which they had to leave but never forgot. Their resettlement in Australia proved to be prosperous by learning the language, marrying and starting families, some of them serving in Australian armies during World Wars. At the same time, the connection to the home country has been developed and maintained by the generations who have since been born and raised in Australia. I'm proud to say that I have a personal connection to the story, one of many destinies found in our legends under the Southern Cross. I was more than happy to tell the story of my auntie and uncle to Mr. Lazovic and provide photographs that illustrate their story. I hope that this small contribution has further enriched Mr. Lazovic's collection and the experience for readers. And at the end, it is true enthusiasts and historical researchers such as Mr. Lazovic and their works that the rich history of early migrants to Australia will be told and lived through future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Biljana. I'd like to call upon Simon Mitrovic, who's one of the descendants from the book, just to talk a little bit about the importance of the book and its contents.
Good evening all. I'd like to say a couple of words in English, and I wouldn't mind saying just a couple of words in my poor Serbian. So you have to excuse if some of the pronunciation is not quite right, but I would like to do a couple of words in that too. But firstly, I'd like to thank the Serbian Consulate for supporting and organising this event to launch the book. Also, a great thank you from the Mitrovic family to Slobodan Lazovic for his efforts over the last several years to produce, collate and finally have the book out into the public eye, which is just a brilliant effort all round. Not only in 2 languages now too, which is pretty amazing. In doing that, he's obviously ensured that future generations will be able to read, find out and learn about the history and the origins of their ancestry, which is really important. Zahvaljujem se Srpske konzulatu I produški I organizovanje ovog događaja. U ime Podpredsjednice Mitrović zahvaljujem Slobodanu Lazoviću za potpun I dugo goštije rad na ovoj knjizi. Na ovaj način gospodin Lazović je usigurao do buduće generacija ne zaboravuje istoriju I poreklo svoje porodice. Hvala.
Thank you, Simon. I'd like to call upon George or Ray Andrich, another descendant from the book, just to talk a little bit about it.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Ray Andrich. I'm the youngest child of Senka and Lazo Andrich, who you just beautifully read out about my mother Senka, who came out to meet a man that she never knew. And just to add to the story about the photograph, my mother told me not that many years ago that the photo she had of Lazo was actually 10 years old. So he was pretty cunning, and so I know where my brother George gets it from. But it was just so nice to read that book, especially being the youngest in the family. My father was about 54 years of age when he had me, being the last of 10. And I remember a wonderful childhood and reading this book, the people that we grew up with, the Mitroviches. My wonderful sister married a wonderful man named Tom Mitrovic, and that was just a marriage in heaven. And the Beciches, that was a beautiful story about Savo Becic. Could you imagine him being on a ship for 42 days, sleeping on the deck, probably not even a pillow, and for his Uncle Savo to greet him in Australia and say, "Son, I don't know if you're going to do any good here, it's not too good." And you've got to see the humour in that, because it's so long ago, and then to think that he got a job cutting cane for £3 a week when he thought it should be £3 a day. I mean, we can only just imagine how tough that would have been. And to have that book now that I can pass on to my children, because I've learned a lot about it. And again, having the Mitroviches and the Nikosiches, who I grew up with as well, the Jurasovics and Sam Becic. It's just you nearly bring a tear to your eye that while you're reading all this, a book of people that are just so close to you just remember growing up with. And I just really like to say, Slobo, thank you very much from the bottom of my heart and our family for putting all this together. You don't know how much it means to me. When my mother turned 90, Slobo came with a beautiful story we put in the paper, and she just really made her the rest of her life. And every time after that I saw, when I see Mum, she says, "Have you seen Slobo? Did you invite him up for a drink?" And so Slobo was the main man. So again, Slobo, thank you very, very much. You've done a wonderful job.
Thanks very much, Ray. I now call upon Zorica ZINGHINI to read the poem Australia by Milica DjURISIC.
In this southern land Australia, where the magpies carol sweetly, where the bush with her regalia captivates the heart completely. The sunrise comes with colours spreading, majestically with gentle passion, where the springtime softly treading, weaves her brush in joyful fashion. Rugged mountains gnarled and hoary, cool and pleasant in the summer, standing massive in their glory, welcoming the weary comer. Waterfalls in sparkling splendour, spilling white foam to the valley, gathering the water's wender, verdant vales the coast to sally. Autumn, calm, the start of barking, and like snakes that shed their coating, forest giant in Manakaki, cast their bark, floor forest floating. Forest rafters green and spacious, cathedral-like in natural shaping, elegantly clean and gracious, over all their colours draping. In this country, lone, appealing, where the kookaburra's laughter chuckles with a joyous feeling from some distant forest rafter. In the highland winter sketches, eurythmic forms in ice and snow, and the morning sunlight stretches over all a golden glow. In this land, the land I cherish, where the shaggy bush waits for me, when I die, I will not perish, but be tombed in earth that bore me.
Thank you, Zorica. I would like to call upon the Honourable Chris Hayes to come up to say a few words.
Well, thank you very much. First, I commence by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land. To my very good friend Slobodan, and congratulate him on his great work. To my colleagues Paul Lynch and Wendy, ladies and gentlemen, and Consul General, once again thank you for your hospitality and also interest in my electorate. By the way, 5% of my electorate is actually made up of people who claim Serbian heritage. So in southwest Sydney, it is quite significant. And one of the things when Slobodan gave me a copy of his book and asked me to read it, I started to think when I went through it as it was almost an eclectic gathering of short stories. Until you started making the connection that this wasn't just stories about people's families, but it was them coming to Australia under various circumstances and the commitment they made here in Australia. Family connections, I always thought then, is that whilst we might be here in the Consul General's Serbian consul office in Sydney, we could have a similar gathering of short stories from probably Paul's ancestors from Ireland, Bernadette's from Scotland, and many other countries whose people decided to come to this country for the very same reason, to give them and their families a better shake in life. And that's one of the things, and as I started, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. The truth is that unless you claim Aboriginal heritage, we are all immigrants or descendants from immigrants in this country. And that's really what's the modern history of Australia. And I think that's really what I got out of Slobodan's writing. And I understand people came and challenged with various issues, needing to actually migrate internationally and to try and give their families a better way of life. But that is the whole basis of modern Australia. There's things I actually took out of it and took some liking to actually. I did like that part about where you can actually organise your daughter's spouse, and I do have a recollection of saying to my daughter one stage I thought I could pick a better husband for her. I think we didn't talk for about 3 or 4 months after that, but happily I do have 4 grandchildren and things are progressing well there, but that's just me, I guess. But look, all jokes aside, what I do get to see in my electorate, the most multicultural electorate in the whole of Australia bar none, I get to see what multiculturalism culturalism is, the real face of modern Australia. How people come out here for a better way of life, how they work together, and how without pretense, they embrace Australian values while maintaining their cultural heritage and tradition. And through my good friends in the Bodywig Sports Club, I see that each year when I go to the Folkloric Festival, when over 1,000 young children come and sing and dance in Serbian culture. It is something that burns within a passion that I think that's right. This is something it is very much traditional Australian. We all come from somewhere else, but we all hanker to actually maintain our cultural roots. And I think Slobodan has captured that. And what I started thinking was an eclectic gathering of short stories. It's actually woven, quite frankly, what you see, the development of the modern face of Australia. So, Slobodan, congratulations. I should say the very first time I met with him, Paul actually introduced me to him, I think, in the Greenway Centre, and Slobodan fills up this tumbler full of scotch and thought, we've got to consummate this relationship. And Paul said, just winked at me and said, well, you've got to do it. So, and we've been mates ever since, so congratulations.
Chris Hayes, Federal Member of the House, thank you. I'd like to call upon the author, Mr. Slobodan.
You ask me?
Okay. Well, I'd like to call upon Mr. Paul Lynch, the State Member of Parliament for New South Wales.
I too commence by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Can I acknowledge the Consul General, my colleagues Chris Hayes, Wendy. Can I acknowledge Mirina Muir, who launched the book? I have to do that because we were in Young Labour together about 30 years ago. The machine just keeps working. Can I also, of course, acknowledge Slobodan, Slobo. Slobodan's a good mate, a good comrade in Labor Party terms. I'm not sure whether you can use the term anymore, but I think the word might be druk. Is that the we've been involved in political organisations for a long time, so it's a pleasure for me to be able to be here. The book is really quite interesting. It touches on the sorts of things Chris talked about the history of this land, about who we are. Unless you've got Aboriginal heritage, all of us came here in the last couple of 100 years. And in that sense, the story that Slobodan tells in that book is a traditional Australian story. It talks about people doing the traditional Australian thing. That is, living somewhere else, making a conscious decision to come here and making this their home. That is the great Australian story. People that don't get that don't actually get our own history. They don't actually get what it is to be Australian. So this is a quintessentially Australian story and a quintessentially Australian book. My great passion in life, in a sense, is history. So there are a couple of things in that book that I found really quite interesting. The contribution of people from Montenegro and from Serbia who joined the Australian Army and fought in the First World War. Now, my grandfather came from Ireland in 1912, fleeing the Black and Tans and the Orangemen. I'm not a great fan of Australia's involvement in the First World War. Most of Australia's involvement in the First World War was us going off, shedding our blood for one empire, fighting another. And that's Cardinal Mannix called it a sordid trade war. But it was very different for the people that were written about in this book, because they were going back to continue a fight that they and their forefathers had fought for hundreds of years against the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't just one empire fighting another, it was a real belief about who they were and wanting freedom for their part of the world. And I find that really quite interesting. It's a much more frankly substantive contribution to Australia's involvement in the First World War than you quite often get. The other bit that I liked, and you'll see why this is the case when I call Slobodan a comrade, but the bits in the book about the trade union involvement, about the involvement in some of the union organisations, and the bits, not that much of it, but the interesting bits about how the community reacted to things that happened in the 40s and the 50s, and the split between the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. I found that a really quite interesting bit, almost of hidden history in Australia. So I think, as someone who loves the history, that's a really useful book. I might perhaps conclude my comments there. Australia's a great multicultural society, but one thing every community shares is an intolerance of politicians that speak for too long. Can I thank you for the invitation to be here? Can I thank the Consul General for his generosity? And can I congratulate Slobodan on producing a really excellent book?
Thank you, Mr. Paul Lynch, State Member, Representative of Liverpool. And finally, for some closing comments, I call upon the author, Mr. Slobodan Lazovic.
Thank you. Good evening to all. I must ask for some apologies because I like to speak on a Serbian language and I have to find a little bit present in this house because we're here. Mr. DjURISIC can follow me on English. Thank you. Dragi prijatelji, prije svega želim da se najtoplije zahvalim vašem odazivu po pozivu njegove ekscelencije ambasadora gospodina Branka Radosevića na ukazanoj mi časti večeras da se knjiga naše legende pod Južnim krstom predstavi u ovoj službenoj rezidenciji Republike Srbije.
Dear friends, first of all, I want to warmly thank you for your response to the invitation by His Excellency, the Ambassador Mr. Branko Radosevic, who's bestowed upon me the honour this evening to present the book Our Legends Under the Southern Cross in the official residence of the Republic of Serbia.
Nemam namjeru da bilo šta kažem u vezi sadržaja ove knjige oko koje smo se večeras okupili poslije ovako veličanstvenog predstavljanja dvaju dana.
I do not intend to say much about the content of the book which we are gathered this evening after such a magnitude of subject matter presented by these two ladies.
Ljudska mi dužnost nalaže da im se najtoplije zahvalim na njihovom razumijevanju i trudu večeras. I želim da istaknem da profesor Biljana i Tomka to i nije prvi put. Njoj sam veoma zahvalan što je primijetila vrijednost mojih do sada izdatih knjiga i kao službenik Gradske biblioteke u Liverpoolu već treći put učestvuje u njihovom predstavljanju. Gospodinu Romanu Cirijeskom, koji večeras nažalost nije tu, također iz Gradske biblioteke Liverpoola upućujem riječi hvale na razumijevanju povodom mojih dosadašnjih izdanja kao doprinos novog doseljenika u multietničkoj sredini.
My human duty dictates that they are warmly thanked for their understanding and effort this evening. And I want to point out that Professor Biljana Tomka, whom, if not the first time, I'm very grateful to her for noting the value of my books issued so far. And as an officer of the City Library of Liverpool, her third time to participate in their presentation. Absent this evening is Mr. Raymond ANDRICH from Liverpool City Library. I'd like to send my thanks to him for his understanding of these books and also understanding the contribution of new immigrants in a multi-ethnic environment.
A šta reći za gospođu Mirinu Muir, koja je došla čak iz Perta specijalno za ovo večer da bude akter predstavljanja knjige u kojoj je njen džet jedan od glavnih ličnosti iz priče u ovoj knjizi. Uvjeren sam da je to za nju poseban događaj, pogotovo kada takvih primjera nijesmo baš česti svjedoci. Neka mi ne bude zamjereno ako kažem da je to i za mene posebna vrijednost večeras koja treba da bude upamćena i da taj gest posluži kao primjer potrebe traganja za našim čovjekom ovdje, jer taj i takvi primjeri nas upoznavaju i čine bliskim jedan drugom. To je potvrda njenog prisustva u večerašnjem skupu pod ovim krovom.
And what to say about Mrs. Mirina Muir, who came all the way from Perth especially for this evening to actively present this book, whose grandfather is one of the major figures of the stories in the book. I am convinced that this is a special event for her, especially when we are scarcely witnesses to such events. Let me not be criticised when I say that this is of special value for me this evening, which should be remembered, and as a gesture to serve as an example of the need to search for our people here, because such examples introduce us to each other and makes us closer to one another. Tonight's presence under this roof confirms that.
Da bi se došlo do večerašnjeg čina, zahvalnost dugujem porodicama potomaka iz ove knjige koji su svojim materijalnim učešćem pomogli izlaženju ovog izdanja na engleskom jeziku. Oni su večeras brojno prisutni i nadam se ponosni na svoje pretke koji su svojim trudom dali primjer kako treba raditi, ne zaboraviti svoj kraj i kako se voli i poštuje zemlja u kojoj su se naselili i formirali svoje porodice, Australiji.
I am very grateful and indebted to the families of the descendants of this book who materially participated to get this book with an edition in the English language. They are represented numerically tonight and hopefully proud of their ancestors, who through their efforts gave an example of how it is done, not forgetting your ancestral home, as well as loving and respecting the country where they settle and form their own families, Australia.
Dalje, dugujem veliku zahvalnost gospođi Milani Petranović, nažalost nije ni ona tu, u Sidneju praktično, profesionalnom prevodiocu i društvenom radniku od ranije, kako za predstavljanje moja dva prethodna izdanja i u njenoj dobroj volji da se angažuje i prevede ovu knjigu bez ikakve materijalne nadoknade, a kao takva bude povoljno dostupna čitaocima engleskog pisma.
Next, a big thanks to Mrs. Melanie Petranovic, who unfortunately isn't here tonight, a professional interpreter and earlier worker in our society. She helped present my two previous books, thanking her also for her willingness to be engaging and translate this book without any material compensation, and thus now is conveniently accessible to readers in the English language.
Lektoru ove knjige, gospođi Mirina Muir, upućujem toplu zahvalnost za stručno obavljenu lekturu koja je knjigu gramatički uredila i dala je literarnu vrijednost.
To the proofreader of this book, Mrs. Mirina Muir, I send her my warm regards, who expertly carried out the proofreading of the book and edited it grammatically, which gave the book its literary value.
Našim njegoševcima, Mitru, Vanji, Duški, Milici i Zorici u zahvalnost najbolje čestitke za još jedan uspješan javni nastup i na odlično urađenom čitanju dijelova iz knjige.
To our njegoševcima Mitar, Vanja, Duška, Milica and Zorica, best congratulations for another successful public performance, as well as wonderfully reading certain extracts of the book.
Na kraju, uvaženi sunarodnici, vama dugujem toplu zahvalnost na vašem odzivu večeras, jer je vaše prisustvo dalo izvanrednu sliku sastanka sa našim legendama pod Južnim krstom.
Finally, esteemed compatriots, I owe a warm thanks for your response this evening. Your presence gave an excellent picture of the meeting for Legends Under the Southern Cross.
I da završim sa rečenicom. Oni koji odluče da imaju ovu knjigu, a prepoznadu nekoga u njoj, neka se sa zadovoljstvom podsjećaju na te ličnosti i vrijeme kada su bitisani. A one koje nisu znali ili prepoznali, neka ih upoznaju i pamte kao takve, uključujući i mjesto gdje se večeras nalazimo. Hvala.
And to conclude with the following sentence, those who decide to have this book and recognize someone in it, may you recall with pleasure those identities and the time they lived, and those that you did not know or recognize, may you get to know them and remember them as such, including the place where we find ourselves this evening. Thank you. Now, if you're interested in the book, there's copies out there to... Yeah, and there's some canapes and drinks available for everyone to enjoy.
Scene. That's it.
All right.
Scene.
Congratulations, Slobodan. Very happy.